Welcome everyone. Thank you for coming today. You're at this webinar about the League of American Bicyclists new report, Reconnecting to the New Majority. I'm Ken McLeod. I'm the lead author of this report. I'm the policy director at the League, and you can find me on Twitter at KenMCLD. I'm very happy to be joined today by Charles T. Brown, the founder and CEO at Equitable Cities, who can be found on Twitter at CTBrown1911. He helped us with this report, going through the process, and ran a focus group that informed this report that we'll talk about later. And then we are also joined by Amelia Neptune, who is the League's Bicycle Friendly America director, and she can be found on Twitter at Neptuna. So very excited to talk to you about this report today. I'll talk, Amelia will talk, and then the three of us will talk about the report, and then we'll have time at the end for questions from all of you. So please be putting those questions in the chat so we can have a great discussion. So the League of American Bicyclists, you probably know who we are because you're on this webinar, but we are a national nonprofit advocacy organization, and our mission is to lead the movement to create a bicycle-friendly America for everyone. Everyone is a very important concept to us, and everyone, making a bicycle-friendly America for everyone cannot be achieved without embracing equity. And this report, when we say equity, we usually mean racial equity, which means addressing the conditions necessary for people of all races and ethnicities to be able to participate and prosper in a bicycle-friendly America. It's a very important concept to us because of the League's history. We've been around since 1880. Unfortunately, in 1894, the League banned people of color from participating in the League and becoming members. That ban was revoked in 1999 under League President Earl Jones, who is an African-American person. And you can find a lot more if you're interested about the League's history. There's a great history written by Hamza Sani, a former equity fellow at the League. And there's a great history that speaks more broadly to the bicycling movement called United Spokes that was put together by Adonia Lugo and Naomi Donor. So it's an important issue to us. We're excited to talk about it. We're excited to make it part of our mission. And the fact that it has been part of our mission since 1999, when we finally revoked that ban that had been forgotten, but still we are working to redress those historical wrongs. So the New Majority was published in 2013 and really kickstarted the League's Equity Initiative, which ran as an initiative until 2015. One of our goals with this Reconnecting to the New Majority report was to update the data in that report and kind of recommit to that work. I think I had aspirations that we would have an action plan coming out of this, but I think one of the biggest takeaways from me from this process is that as a primarily white organization with white leadership, we need to make sure that we are partnering and including voices of the people that we want to serve. And that's going to make all of our actions stronger. So really excited to dive into it. So some of the big takeaways of the report is that persistent racial disparities persist, but there have been some changes in demographics. So when we're looking at the New Majority is typically more racially diverse, younger. In bike trips, we have this data from the National Household Travel Survey that's put out by the US Department of Transportation. It comes out about once a decade. And what it showed in its most recent data, which came out in 2017, is decreases in non-Hispanic white trips as a share of bike trips and Black or African American trips as a share of bike trips, and increases amongst people who identify as multiracial, Asian, or of Hispanic status. The other major data set that we have on biking and walking in the United States comes from the Census Bureau's American Community Survey, which tells us what mode of travel people use to get to work most of the time for the majority of their distance to work. And it really shows persistently low bike to work rate amongst people who identify as Black or African American. It's about 0.3%, which is about half of the national average of 0.6%. And it is unfortunately widespread and persistent. It's one of the things that I really think back to as I went through the process of updating this data, just how much that captures the lack of access and lack of safe infrastructure that people who identify as Black or African American have access to. Some of those persistent racial disparities. So bicycling is probably widely perceived as white, and that is backed up by the data that shows that white people make up a disproportionate amount of trips. It's more for biking than for walking or for all modes of travel that are more like the normal population percentages than biking. So there is this disparity, and you can also see that that proportion of trips by people who identify as Black or African American is also significantly smaller for biking than for walking or all modes of travel. So that is a persistent disparity. And it's something that should make us think, why does that disparity exist? How has our history of policy created that disparity? And how can our policy now address that disparity so that everyone has what they need to be able to participate and prosper in a bicycle-friendly America for everyone. The burden of traffic violence is also not evenly distributed. People who identify as American Indian, non-Hispanic, have one of the highest burdens of traffic violence. This measure is from the CDC and discusses years of potential life loss, which is based on when people die in relationship to their age 65. So that's the years of potential life lost is the measure. So people who identify as American Indian or Black non-Hispanic or Asian Pacific Islander have seen increases in that measure of life lost. In the last decade, people who identify as white Hispanic have seen a decrease, which is encouraging, but still see some of the highest rates. In the New Majority Report in 2013 and this Reconnecting to the New Majority Report now, both included polling data from a nationally representative poll that the League paid for. And it shows really consistent support amongst people who identify as Black for improvements in bicycling. It's higher than the strong agreement rates for people who identify as non-Hispanic white, but we've seen both increase from 2012 until 2020 when we commissioned the poll. So it's really positive to see the support for bicycling, and it's really important to recognize that people who identify as Black or African American in this poll are potentially some of our strongest allies in improving bicycling for everyone. It was also really great to see just general agreement, strongly agree or agree at all at that 78% in 2020, which is really strong. So we then asked people, what would make them ride more often? We want more people riding. It's important in a bicycle-friendly America that people ride. So we asked about more bike lanes and trails, secure bike parking, people to bike with, learning more about bicycle safety, and less concern over interaction with police. So for everyone, kind of that infrastructure was very high. Everyone but non-Hispanic Black people said that more bike lanes and trails is the most important thing that will make them ride more often. Secure bike parking came in second for most groups. The non-Hispanic white people had people to bike with as second, And then I think interesting for us, the question about less concern over interactions with police was new for our poll in 2020. It wasn't in our poll in 2012. So it kind of showed up in the non-Hispanic Black respondents, where that came out higher than learning about bicycle safety. safe riding skills. So that was a really interesting result. And in our focus group, we heard even more about the importance of that. And I just also want to touch on differences between younger and older people. Most of the report is focused on racial equity, but there are huge differences between younger people and older people. Younger people are much more interested in these things that'll make them ride more often. Older people are less so. We see kind of people to bike with come up more for older people. Everyone is supportive of more bike lanes and trails. And yeah, I think those are the important takeaways there. So I'm happy to hand it over to my colleague, Amelia Neptune, to kind of talk about how we are trying to put these things into action in our Bicycle Friendly America program.
Thanks, Ken. And I hope my audio works a little better than it was earlier. So thanks everybody for your feedback and patience, and let me know if it's not coming through clearly. So you can go ahead to the next slide, Ken. So in the Bicycle Friendly America program, if you're not familiar with it, every other year we rank all 50 states on how bicycle friendly they are. And then for communities, businesses, and universities, it's an opt-in program, meaning those entities apply to us for recognition and for feedback. And the goal of these programs is really to help all of these entities improve and to become more bike friendly. But it's been brought to our attention many times over the years that, you know, an important question is bicycle friendly for whom? Within these communities, it's not a one-size-fits-all experience. And I think it's really important for us at the League and in the Bicycle Friendly America program to acknowledge and recognize the fact that there are a lot of racial disparities in the experiences of people biking. And those disparities have not been very well reflected in the Bicycle Friendly Community application and the review process and the awards. So we are working to fix that. And it's not going to be a quick overnight change, but the input from the focus group and this report has helped to inform it. And I'll also share a little bit about other things we're doing over the coming year to make some of those improvements. Next slide. So first, a little bit of background. The Bicycle Friendly America programs are all evaluated on criteria that we call the 5 E's. Starting in 2003, those E's were engineering, education, encouragement, enforcement, and evaluation and planning. In 2014, we added the unofficial 6th E of equity and worked with the Equity Initiative Manager and the Equity Advisory Council at the League to come up with what we referred to as the BFA beta questions that were sort of testing out some equity concepts across the different BFA programs. But to be honest, we recognize that those equity questions introduced in 2014 really just barely begin to scratch the surface of the topics that should be addressed when you're trying to center and elevate equity properly. And then in 2020, we officially removed enforcement from the 5 E's and officially elevated equity, diversity, and inclusion as the 5th E. Next slide. And I want to talk a little bit about that removal of the enforcement E, and I'll copy these links into the chat box as well so that you can explore these. And there's even a full hour-long town hall that Ken and I did together at the National Bike Summit earlier this year on this topic. So if you are interested in learning more, there's a lot more on our website. Next slide. But just to give a very brief overview, I wanted to make it clear that just because we removed the official E of enforcement doesn't mean that we're not talking about enforcement anymore. Enforcement continues to be a reality and continues to be, for many, a barrier to bicycling. And it's really important for us to continue collecting data on that. But we felt that it was necessary to reframe how we talk about enforcement. Having a standalone E as enforcement gave many communities the impression that if they weren't doing, armed law traffic enforcement in their community, they couldn't become a BFC. And the police needed to be involved in certain safety activities. For example, the question of, are you giving out free helmets and lights in your community used to be under the enforcement E. Removing the enforcement E was, one really obvious change for us, was moving that question and expanding the services offered into encouragement, recognizing that police don't need to be involved in these, light giveaway activities. They can be, you're not going to lose points necessarily if your police department is the one doing that activity. But if your bike co-op or your local advocacy group or your school is the one doing it, by all means, that counts just as much. Next slide. Another example of this is how we frame the question of crash data collection. We used to frame the question as, do police officers report bike crash data? We've realized and recognized over the years that hospitals, bike advocacy organizations, academic research institutions, many others, state highway departments, many others are collecting crash data, and it doesn't need to lie solely with the police. Obviously, emergency responders should be involved in crash data collection and reporting, but we don't want communities to think that police are the only ones that should be doing this. Next slide. And then finally, a lot of the enforcement questions that we did keep, we wanted to expand under evaluation and planning so that there really is this focus on accountability and transparency when it comes to traffic enforcement. So the question that we previously had about how a community uses traffic citation data has been expanded. And if you go to the next slide, you might be able to read it a little better. This is the same question, just in bigger font. But as you'll see, we added a lot of options for demographic related data and what's done with that, whether or not it's collected, whether it's made publicly available, and so forth. Next slide. And then finally, we added some new open-ended questions. For example, what, if any, policies or practices does your community have in place to measure and eliminate racial bias in traffic law enforcement, including in-person and automated enforcement practices? So right now, this is an open-ended question, and we are very much using it to get information about what communities are doing as sort of a baseline. And we do hope that in the future, we'll be able to use some of the best practices we've seen to encourage other communities to improve their efforts. Next slide. So again, I'll post these links in the chat in just a moment, but I wanted you to see them one more time. Next slide. And then looking forward, the BFC application is actually offline right now and will remain offline for submissions until next May, because we're working with a number of partners and program users to update the application to better integrate equity throughout the application. Removing enforcement was a big step last year. But we knew when we officially elevated equity as the fifth E that we had a lot of work to do to actually make that fifth E, a standalone thing that communities take seriously. And so over the coming 7 or 8 months, we're going to be doing a lot of research, outreach, and partnerships. There's a quick link here that I'll also put in the chat box if you're interested in getting involved and participating in some of our future interviews or focus groups or surveys. We welcome that participation and really, look forward to making this a participatory process so that we can hear from program users and bike advocates about what their priorities are. And at the 2022 National Bike Summit next March, we'll be previewing some of the application updates a couple months before they actually go live to get feedback from people. Next slide. And then just to give you a sense, and I'll talk more about this in the discussion portion of the webinar, but just a few of the ways that we're thinking about equity in the BFC application. So one is we do public surveys as part of the review process. It's really important for us to hear from bicyclists in the communities as part of our evaluation of that community to make sure that what the community is reporting on their application is actually representative of what people are experiencing. But up until last year, we weren't really sure who was responding to these surveys. And so we've added demographic questions to the surveys to get a sense of how representative our survey pool is in every community. And then, through the various sections of the BFC application, you'll start to see more and more very specific suggestions and recommendations and questions around equity considerations. One really big example is in the bike infrastructure section, the on-road bike network section of the engineering part of the application. Right now, we just ask for raw numbers of bike lane miles, different bike facility type miles. We just ask for the mileage numbers. There's no specific question around the distribution of those miles, where they are, what neighborhoods they're in, how representative the people who have best access to it are, whether neighborhoods are connected, whether homes are actually connected to destinations, whether those miles of bike facilities are connected to each other. So there's a lot of work to do to do equity analysis of, looking at demographic overlays, looking at baseline data of socioeconomic and racial disparities in the community, and seeing how your bike infrastructure compares, and making sure that you're not perpetuating disparities in safety and ridership as you plan and build your bike network. We also will have a number of focus questions on EDI staff and committees and their involvement in biking, a focus on racial equity action plans. We currently have some questions about various affinity and identity related groups, education and encouragement that focuses on those groups, shifting that perspective a little bit to be more about who's leading those groups and how the community is supporting, for example, BIPOC-led education and encouragement efforts in the community, and equity data, baseline and tracking your equity-related data, demographic data, socioeconomic data, so forth, and setting goals. So I share all of that as a very high level, like giving people a sense of some of the things we're thinking about. But again, this is going to be a long process over the next 7 or 8 months to integrate some of these considerations. And even when those changes go live next May, I don't expect us to be done. There will still be iterative updates going forward after that, as there always have been in the BFC program. So with that, I'm going to hand it back to Ken, and we're going to start discussing a little bit more of the focus group results and what we learned with Charles Brown.
Yeah, thank you for that, Amelia. So we were very lucky and grateful to engage with Charles T. Brown from Equitable Cities to have a focus group as part of this. For me, I wanted a focus group to help with our interpretation of our nationally representative polling data. There's a lot of ways you can read into polling data. And as a white person and mostly white organization, I just wanted to make sure we were getting feedback to kind of give more shape to how we should interpret some of those polling results. And I thought we could talk about some of the things that resonated with us from that in this section. So Charles, do you want to say anything now about the focus group, or should I start talking about this first point that resonated with us?
Yes, hey Ken, Charles T. Brown. I think before we get into what we learned through the focus groups, to add on to what you've said, one of the main reasons why we did this is because we understood the importance of Black voices and Black perspectives as it related to the national survey. Quantitative research is of critical importance. However, those first-person experiences, the humanizing of the data, and those stories, those experiences from Black thought leaders throughout the country who were included in this focus group, I think added a richness to this work that we would not have gotten otherwise. We also were very intentional about the intersectionality approach as a lens to this work, in particular looking at women of color, persons who are of a certain sexual orientation, et cetera. We wanted to ensure that those voices were a part of this, because in those national studies, while they are quote unquote representative, many of the Black and brown folks on the ground feel like that national representativeness doesn't tell the full story. So this focus group allowed us to dig deeper into what the issues are. And I think the richness of those conversations aided us in painting a better and a fuller picture, as you'll see here moving forward. Thanks, Ken.
Yeah, thank you, and 100% agree. A question like more bike lanes and trails would make me ride my bike more often. It was great to have the focus group engage with that question and be more specific about their experiences, and how they were clear that as the league, we should be saying, when we say bicycle friendly America for everyone, we mean really great safe, separated bike infrastructure for everyone. And that for many people to use bike infrastructure, if they're going to be using that to access a job or access services in their community or places in their community, it needs to be within a transportation system that doesn't just work for people biking, but it's walking, transit. It's recognizing that people are multimodal and people have multiple needs. And biking is one of them, but not the only one. So for me, it was great to hear that. It was great to engage with it. And since the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act just passed, I just wanted to touch on a couple of things here that I think can really help us fulfill this kind of goal and feedback and meet the needs of people. So the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act has a vulnerable road user assessment that every state will have to do. So looking at roadway designs and traffic speeds and access to low stress corridors. And I think it'd be great if bicycle and pedestrian organizations, the league, and our members really push to make sure that those vulnerable road user assessments are in areas that don't have existing bike infrastructure, are really capturing those places that have the greater need, so that we get that data and we get that feedback from every state. Another thing I want to highlight here is that the Transportation Alternative Set-Aside Program, which provides the majority of federal funding for biking and walking in the United States, got an increase of more than 60%, but also has a prioritization process where project location and impact in high need areas, as defined by the state, is something that must be a priority in that competitive process. So every state will have a process coming up in the next year where they're going to have to define what that high need area is. So that in the bill, it talks about low income, transit dependent, rural, or other areas. This is an opportunity to talk about what high need is in your communities, partner with BIPOC-led organizations that know their experience of need and can articulate that and make sure that they can access these funds and make sure that they're prioritized in these competitive grant processes. Amelia, would you like to add anything from the BFC perspective? I feel like she's frozen.
Yeah, sorry. A little bit. Yeah, I think this is another, I touched on this a little bit with how we frame our questions around infrastructure and ensuring that we talk about, the holistic network and not just, piecemeal lane miles. But I think, something I heard in the focus group was a concern about, in places where there's been historical disinvestment or underinvestment, the concern that, future improvements are also going to be subpar rang loud and clear, that, specifying that when we say bike infrastructure, we mean high quality infrastructure that provides the best safety, access, and comfort to anyone looking to ride a bike in that area. So that was a takeaway of being more clear and more intentional when we talk about bike infrastructure. The quality shouldn't be taken for granted as a given. That being explicit is important.
I think another key piece here is the need to emphasize the fact that they stated whatever we do, it needs to recognize the multimodal nature of people who not only just bike, walk, but also who take transit and drive in the community. The focus group took a very systems level approach to transportation and mobility instead of the singular focus on the bicycle. They see the importance of bicycling, but given the various needs in their community, they need system level change. And too often in our discussions, the bicycle community, we're so focused on the bike that we ignore its very intimate connection with other modes as an option to improve the mobility of everyone. I think another thing is looking at the chart. You see in the chart that the South and then the West comparatively to the Northeast and Midwest as very car dominant places. So in order to encourage cycling among the racialized minority low-income populations in those groups to make them bike more often, bike trails in particular is something of importance. So the data was complemented by the feedback from the focus group, and this just better paints a picture as to why, one, it's important to talk to them, but two, to have a mixed method approach to your research.
I think we've covered that. I checked the chat, which was probably a bad idea. I know one of the things that was said in there was like, did the relative poor quality of infrastructure in an area impact how people would say they supported investments in biking or biking and bike lanes and trails? And I do think it's interesting to see the South show up higher in this chart than other regions. And I wonder if that reflects the relative lack of bike lanes and trails in the South. But again, it's the type of thing where a mixed methods approach with a focus group could really help us dig into that type of thing if our focus group had been specific to people in the South. So another thing that really was super helpful to hear from the focus group was just the need for more research. We recognize that there has been a lot of research on disparities, racial disparities, systemic racism, how infrastructure has played a role in that, whether that is, the biography of Robert Moses and the Power Broker, or that is Charles T. Brown's research that has been featured through places like the Better Bike Share Partnership. But it was really interesting to hear just the idea of researching the effects of building out very high quality infrastructure in a Black community, and then seeing what effects that has in 5 to 10 years, thinking about potential displacement or other changes that might happen. Definitely gentrification and displacement is something we hear a lot about when there's new bike infrastructure, and there have been very public kind of fights around that in various cities. So again, I'm gonna connect this to the recently passed IIJA, and that included the Reconnecting Communities pilot program, where if you see in the news $1 billion for tearing out highways, that is that program. That's not going to do this high quality bike infrastructure in Black communities, but it is an opportunity to study what transportation changes do to affect communities. And I think it's important to think about. And then it's also important to think about the reconciliation bill that hasn't been passed yet. There's about $4 billion for a neighborhood access and equity program in that bill, and almost $10 billion for an affordable housing program in that bill. And both of those things are hopefully going to go to communities that have had a history of disinvestment and really have those high needs. So that if you're thinking about research and seeing what the effects of getting bike infrastructure into place, I'm very hopeful with the passage of the IIJA and the reconciliation bill, we'll have more examples of that and opportunities for research. Every time that communities are making an investment, it is an opportunity to see what the outcomes of that investment are. And it's important to kind of hear that we still need to build that case. We need to have that research. And Amelia or Charles, would one of you like to talk a bit more?
You can go first, Charles. Okay, I'll say that this was a really interesting point, that highlighting the fact that there isn't very much data on the question of gentrification and displacement in terms of before and after studies looking at bike infrastructure that really show like a 5 or 10 year demographic analysis of an area after that infrastructure has gone in. So I think there's an opportunity for the BFC application to encourage communities to do that kind of research. I think, the tools exist out there. There is, it is happening in academic circles, but I think at the community scale, it's not happening as much as we would like to see. And I think the other thing, and someone's comment about this right before this came up on Ken's slide, phrased it in a way that I think is important, that the perception is really important. The fact that bicycle infrastructure can be seen as a gentrifying element matters. Whether or not it's proven with data is less important when the concern is there, because the concern needs to be addressed and needs to be talked about. There was a great APBP webinar on this topic just a couple of weeks ago. And there is some good, some good best practices coming out about how to prevent and avoid displacement as part of improving areas with bike infrastructure and other kinds of transportation improvements. So all of that just to say, the BFC application can do a lot more to encourage communities to engage in this conversation as well.
Yes, I think it's also important to pay attention to the data that we see in the chart. As shown among non-Hispanic Blacks, more of them actually disagree in total too, that their community would be safer and more comfortable by bicycle investments. Why is that? Because they don't just see the bicycle as the deciding factor. So when they think about safety and comfort, while the bike is the central focus of RP, to them, again, they look at a systems level approach. And I think that's the most important takeaway here, along with the importance to do these longitudinal studies, not simply because of gentrification, but much more so because of displacement and cultural erasure. And so if we can deal with those two things, I think we'll go a long ways in helping people to understand how the bike can be transformative in a positive sense.
Yeah, and there's a comment in the focus group that I recall of, seeing a new bike lane come in and saying, is that for me, or is that for someone who's, the city hopes replaces me? And I think that is the crux of it, that, that concern really does matter. So again, whether it's been proven or not, the perception that, that bike infrastructure may not be for me and may be intended to get me out of my, my neighborhood. That's really important, and bike advocates need to take that seriously. So.
Yeah, I mean, everyone is everyone. It's not it's not one group of people displacing another. We need to make sure that investments can be made and people's lives can be improved without that cultural erasure or neighborhood erasure. So this was a really important feedback point for me. I honestly forget how we drafted this question for the poll, but we drafted it as less concern over interactions with police would make me ride my bike more often. And the focus group, I think, did a great job of giving this more context and saying, where is this concern coming from? What is this concern about? And I think for me and for the league, I think that concern is concern with police violence. Traffic stops are the most common form of police-initiated interaction with people. And then there's been reporting showing that a quarter of police killings of unarmed Black people began with a traffic stop. So if we are embracing 0 deaths as our traffic safety goal, I think the deaths that result from interactions with police have to be a part of that. We can't arbitrarily cut off where traffic safety begins and ends if we are saying that armed police enforcement is a core part of how we do traffic safety. So it's really interesting to see our polling being fairly strong, that concerns over interactions with police does keep people from riding, and less concerns would make them ride more often. And yeah, to connect this, as I've been doing to the IIJ, there is a program in there called the Driver Officer Safety Education Grant Program, which kind of has the same interpretation thing. It's a program that funds education around the roles and laws and practices for safe interactions between police and people that they pull over. It can be either training of law enforcement or driver training through like a driver's education program. So it can either deal with, it kind of go over way, addressing the concerns by educating people about how to act well to police, or educating police how to act so they aren't creating potential conflict where there doesn't need to be conflict. The other kind of really good win is there's a program called the Racial Profiling Prohibition Grant Program. It was increased $4 million from $7.5 million to $11.5 million. And that allows people to collect data and implement programs addressing racial profiling that is found in their data, doing public outreach, trying to get to the practices that can still keep people safe, but not result in racial disparities through traffic law enforcement. So those are kind of the two IIJA connections that I wanted to make here. Amelia, do you want to make some BFC connections?
Yeah, I think, I already covered the removal of the official enforcement E, but how we, will continue to evaluate and encourage communities to evaluate their enforcement practices to ensure that, it is not a barrier, and, to the extent that it's done equitably and effectively, but it is not the first point of, the first solution that communities turn to when it comes to traffic safety. We really want to encourage communities to think upstream, to think of their infrastructure first as the way to encourage safe driving behaviors, safe cycling behaviors. The concept of self-enforcing streets is one that I find really intriguing, where, design the road so that people comply rather than having an armed law enforcement officer there to intimidate people into complying. And studies have shown that that is, in fact, much more effective in producing safer results, in addition to, removing this huge barrier, especially for people of color, in how they get around. Yeah.
The only thing I will add here is, as stated by the focus group participants, the interaction with law enforcement isn't so much as a problem as discriminatory policing and the resulting police violence. It's important to make that distinction because many interpret concern over interaction with criminal behavior on the behalf of the cyclist, that's a person of color, meaning one is intentionally avoiding an interaction because they may possess, on their persons some sort of narcotics or other criminal things, which is not the case whatsoever. So the concern isn't policing per se, the concern is discriminatory policing and the resulting police violence. Because as we know, these policies can easily be used as in pretextual ways from a discriminatory policing standpoint to target specifically people of color, and then more specifically, Black males. So I think that's the importance here in clarifying what they want, as you have done here, Ken. Thanks.
Yeah, and I think I saw someone in the chat provide a link to the Los Angeles Times reporting that I think came out last week on officer stops of people who are biking. And I feel like it's like 85% of them led to a search of the person, primarily done in areas with lower income, primarily affecting people who identified as Hispanic. So there is a lot of reporting out there on that racially biased policing of people. And it doesn't improve bicycle safety or traffic safety when it is biased in that way. So another thing that it was good to get feedback from the focus group on is kind of that removing the E and enforcement still existing and still being part of the conversation about improving enforcement. Very strong agreement that more ticketing should not lead to more positive bicycle-friendly community awards. And really strong support that racial disparities in ticketing should affect bicycle-friendly award decisions, which you can't get that data without asking about it. So that's why we kept a lot of those questions that had been under enforcement and put them other places in the, now I'm doing Amelia's part, sorry.
That's okay. Yeah, so putting it under evaluation and planning because it needs to be scrutinized as, you know, as an evaluation task for communities to collect that data, to look at that data, to use that data to improve, to hold their police departments accountable, and to make sure that, you know, disparities are being identified and removed. So I think, you know, something that the BFC application has long had is questions, to Charles's point, questions like, you know, do you have mandatory helmet laws or mandatory sidewalk rules about not riding on the sidewalks, mandatory bike registration laws. And our practice for many years has been to encourage communities to remove those laws because we've known for a long time that those can be used solely for discrimination purposes. And, you know, for everyone, they serve to discourage people from riding. So it was important to keep questions like that, for example, in the application, and to continue to emphasize that, you know, a mandatory helmet law, while we encourage helmet use, we do not support mandatory helmet laws because, you know, we've seen it be used in this discriminatory way. And so I think the removal of the official E, enforcement E, and shifting that focus helped to emphasize the fact that we're asking about some laws, not because they're good, but because we want to keep track of where they're happening and how they're being applied, and whether they're being used for discrimination.
Yes, I think that's one of the highlights, and it's something I mentioned during my keynote address at your last summit. You know, we have the bicycle-friendly designation, we have business-friendly, university-friendly designations, but we have to strongly consider what it means to designate one as bicycle-friendly when we know there persists the discriminatory enforcement and violence against people of color. You know, what sort of message were we sending by giving out those awards with that happening? So I think now collecting more data as it relates to the existence and the persistence of such discriminatory practices in these communities is gonna, I think, help move us closer to the goalposts of equity and a much more inclusive bicycle movement.
You know, we have about 10 minutes left and there's probably some good stuff in the chat, but I still want to run through my IIJA thing. So very quickly, if you're interested in engaging with enforcement and how the US approaches it from a traffic safety perspective, you should know your highway safety office. IIJA provides about $700 million in grants each year that are going to be programmed through your highway safety office at the state level. There's a non-motorized safety program that's part of that got increased by around $8 million per year. So there's $23 million per year nationwide, specifically for biking and walking. One of the great things that the IIJA has is that $23 million can now be specifically used to educate motorists and non-motorists about infrastructure designed to improve non-motorized safety. So we're really hopeful that that'll give permission to highway safety offices to fund things like pop-up bike lanes and do demonstration infrastructure that shows that our roadways can be safer if we design them to be safer. So definitely engage on that. Another thing that's coming is performance measures for those funding programs for about $360 million a year. Right now, the only activities that they are measured on are seatbelt and speeding citations and DUI arrests. So we would really encourage more performance measures around things like public engagement or equity maybe even not having racial disparities in ticketing, if they're going to have that ticketing activity. And then there's two more things, sorry. There's a Safe Streets for All grant program that funds Vision Zero or Towards Zero Deaths programs. In the text of the bill, it says that those programs will ensure equitable investment in the safety needs of underserved communities and preventing transportation-related fatalities and injuries. So if you have had an experience with Vision Zero where it was implemented in a way that you felt wasn't meeting the needs of underserved communities, the text of the IIJA provides a hook to change that implementation at the local level, point out that that is not the intention of the federal government for what Vision Zero should mean. And finally, there is a section on innovative highway safety countermeasures. These are innovative safety countermeasures, specifically other than traffic enforcement. So it's good to see that recognized by Congress. It'll be good to see how USDOT and NHTSA interpret that. But we know we're interested in moving upstream and away from so much reliance on enforcement, and we're seeing it reflected in what Congress is doing as well. And with that, I'll let us go to questions and see what people have been saying.
Yeah, so Ken and Charles, I'll encourage you to scroll through the chat as well, because there's been a lot of activity. So just to make sure I don't miss anything, feel free to jump in with questions that you want to respond to. I got one question directly in the Q&A box, which is different from the chat box, asking for communities that have received BFC status when they reapply, or are they ever demoted or denied continued status because they're not continuing to prove an effort to maintain their status? Does the league require continued proof of effort, or do you just take their word on the application? The answer to this is yes. Sometimes communities have lost their designations, been demoted, or lost their award level altogether. It is rare, but it has happened. Usually it's because something has been actively removed. And over time, the BFC criteria has evolved a lot. The example I always love to give is bike share didn't exist 15 years ago the way it exists now. And it used to be something that, really only the gold and platinum communities might have. And now it's become so standard in most US cities. And so things like that, where, what used to be really cutting edge, top notch, you only see it in the best communities, like protected bike lanes, for example, we're starting to see normalized, which is a great thing. And so as communities reapply, they're required to reapply every 4 years. We want to see that they're improving too, to meet those raising standards. Because equity is new as an official standalone E, I think one of the big decision points for us this year and over the next year will be whether to demote communities if they're not doing enough around equity. And I think there's a really good argument to be made that yes, if, in order to take this seriously and to make sure that communities are taking it seriously, we need to be willing to do that. So I imagine there may be some grace period where we give communities their feedback and say, if you don't do X, Y, Z, through the equity lens over the coming 2 years, you're at serious risk of losing your designation. It might be sort of soft like that, or it might be, the next time you apply, if you aren't able to check enough boxes in this section, you could lose your award level or be demoted to the next award level down. So it's a really important question, and it's one of the things we'll be looking at through our outreach over the coming months. But the short answer is yes, that can happen, and it has happened for many communities. And it's also important to know that just applying to the BFC program doesn't automatically get you an award. About 60% of first-time applicants get no award or honorable mention, and only 40% get bronze or higher. So it's not a participation trophy, although many perceive it to be. Charles, I'm looking at you. So yeah, thanks for that question.
I think that's an excellent question. And I think for many of those who have been skeptical of, the bicycle friendly program, we can just wait and see how things turn out as it relates to equity. I can say, as it related to my efforts with the league during this process, the league was very open to engaging with, the Black thought leaders as it related to the data. So I'm just really interested in seeing how that new relationship builds and grows as we move forward.
All right, I'm going to highlight another question that I think will be for Ken about the community support slide. It showed that about 30% of Black Americans say their communities would be better if biking was safer and more comfortable. But given the low levels of Black cycling, are respondents saying their communities would be better because they themselves could bike, or simply that neighborhoods with bike lanes often have other safety infrastructure, such as road diets, pedestrian infrastructure, etc.? Perhaps people are responding to that. Can you talk to that? And Charles, if that came up in the focus group.
Well, before Ken answers that question, I think it's important to point out that we don't know if there is a low level of Black cycling.
I think that's a great point. The data that we have from the National Household Travel Survey and the American Community Survey is incredibly incomplete. It's that nationally representative kind of polling kind of style for the National Household Travel Survey and the American Community Survey. The American Community Survey is specifically about the journey to work. We know that there are persistent differences in rates of employment between the Black community and white community, and that's going to leave people out that are unemployed. So I think we could have far better data collection about what's actually happening in communities to capture how much cycling there is in the Black community. I think for that question, we don't know really the thoughts of those people who answered it, if they are comparing their community to other parts of their community and see those other parts of their community as nicer because they have bike lanes or whatever, or if it's a more systemic thing. So it's something that I don't think the focus group spoke to, and I think we would need to do many more focus groups, potentially as we work through the bicycle friendly community update. We'll get a better understanding of that as we hear more people's voices to give context to that sort of data point.
And one thing that I'm looking to do to answer that question much more directly from the Black perspective is a nationwide survey of the Black population, along with additional focus groups, to better understand what their barriers to biking may be. I think the key takeaway here is that we need disaggregated data around how Black people travel and choose to exercise, about which modes, because right now, the only thing that we can rely on is what Ken said, which was the National Household Travel Survey.
All right, and I realize we are just about at time. So if we didn't get to your question, I will download the chat and we'll do our best to sort of respond to people offline, and also address any open-ended questions and any recap blogs that we do. So I want to thank everyone for attending today, and a huge thank you to Charles T. Brown for your help conducting the focus group and informing this report, Ken for writing the report and presenting on the findings today. Really appreciate everyone's time and input, and look forward to continuing this conversation throughout the BFC equity update process and ongoing league work. So if you two have any other closing remarks, feel free.
Let's stay in touch. Thank you all for being here. Salute to the League of American Bicyclists, in particular, Ken, Amelia, and Bill, for the great work that you've been doing. Let's stay connected. We can go much further together. Thank you.
Yeah, it was really great to work with you, and hopefully continue to do so. Your work around arrested mobility has been really inspiring, and I think help really guides us in our mission.
Take care, all.
Thanks, everyone. Have a great day.